She never imagined that her uncle's inheritance, an isolated pipeline in the middle of the desert, would hide a secret capable of toppling empires. The young woman inherited the barren land, believing it would be just an old, useless piece of metal buried in the sand. A failed business, a burden. But on the night she visited the site for the first time, something caught her attention. The pressure gauges were rising, and nobody knew why. There were no workers, no active maintenance, no operation records. The pipeline should have been dead, abandoned for years, yet the numbers climbed as if someone, or something, was pumping gas from an unknown source, invisible and impossible to locate on any map. Intrigued and frightened, she began to investigate. With each step, more questions emerged. Why did her uncle never sell that pipeline? Why did he insist that when she grew up, it would save the family? And why had unknown men started appearing in the desert at night, prowling the site, as if searching for something that belonged to them? The wind carried sand across the rusted metal as Maya Torres stood before the control panel, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the abandoned facility. 28 years old, petroleum engineering degree gathering dust in her apartment back in Albuquerque, and here she was, inheriting a ghost. If you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This story gets darker than you think. And comment below telling me where you're watching from. I want to know if anyone else has experienced something like this. The needle on the main pressure gauge trembled at 72 psi. Yesterday it had been at 68. The day before, 63. A steady, inexplicable climb that defied every law of thermodynamics she'd learned in school. Dead pipelines don't pressurize themselves. They leak, they decay, they become hollow tombs of industrial ambition. But this one was breathing. Maya's phone buzzed. No signal out here, but the notification from 3 hours ago finally loaded. Meeting requested, urgent. J. Castellanos, VP Operations, Apex Energy Solutions. She'd received 4 similar messages this week from companies she'd never heard of, each one more insistent than the last, each one carefully avoiding the word buy while making it clear they wanted this land. Her uncle Raymond had died 6 months ago in a single-car accident on Highway 180, his pickup wrapped around a telephone pole at 3 in the morning. The police report said he'd been driving 90 miles per hour with no explanation for why he'd been on that road at that hour. No alcohol in his system, no phone records indicating distress, just a man driving too fast into oblivion. At the funeral, Raymond's lawyer had pressed a sealed envelope into her hands. Inside, a handwritten note. The desert keeps secrets better than people do. Don't trust anyone who offers you money for this. The pressure will tell you everything. R.T. Maya had thought it was paranoid rambling from a man who'd spent too many years alone in the sun. Now, watching the gauge needle quiver upward, she wasn't so sure. The facility consisted of 3 structures: the main valve station where she stood, a rusted storage tank that hadn't seen use in decades, and a small cinder block building that might have once served as an office. Raymond's papers indicated the pipeline had been part of a failed venture in the early 2000s, a private consortium attempting to bypass major distribution networks with an independent line. The project had collapsed financially, leaving behind 43 miles of buried pipe stretching southeast into federal land. Officially, the line was capped and decommissioned. The state records confirmed it. The Federal Bureau of Land Management had inspected it twice and declared it sealed and abandoned, yet here it was, generating pressure from nowhere. Maya pulled out the original engineering schematics she'd found in Raymond's storage unit. The pipeline ran from this station straight through the Chihuahuan Desert, terminating at what should have been a connection point with a natural gas field that had never been developed. According to geological surveys from 2003, the area had shown insufficient reserves for commercial viability. The project had been abandoned before the first cubic foot of gas ever flowed. She traced the route with her finger, noting the depth markers. The pipe ran between 8 and 12 feet underground for most of its length, deeper where it crossed seasonal wash zones. Standard installation for desert conditions where surface temperatures could cause dangerous expansion. A sound outside froze her mid-thought. Not the wind, not the settling groan of metal. This was mechanical, the low rumble of a vehicle engine cutting through the night silence. Maya killed her flashlight and moved to the window. Through the cracked glass, she saw headlights approaching from the service road, still half a mile distant, but moving deliberately toward the station. No reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest ranch was 14 miles north, and the facility was posted with private property and no trespassing signs. She'd driven out in her uncle's old Ford F-150, now parked behind the valve station. Whoever was approaching wouldn't see it immediately. She had maybe 3 minutes before they arrived. Maya's instinct screamed at her to run, but something Raymond had written kept her rooted. The pressure will tell you everything. She pulled out her phone, switched it to camera mode, and started recording the gauge panel. If nothing else, she'd have documentation of what was happening here. The vehicle, a black Suburban with tinted windows, pulled up to the front of the station and stopped, engine still running. 2 men emerged, both wearing desert tactical clothing that looked more military contractor than petroleum company. They carried high-powered flashlights and moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. Maya crouched below the window line, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through a gap in the corroded metal siding, she watched them approach the main valve assembly. One man produced a tablet, scanning it, while the other examined the pressure gauges with a handheld device she didn't recognize. "Still climbing," the first man said, his voice carrying on the dry air. 17% increase over last week. "Castellanos isn't going to like this," the second man replied. "If it breaches 80 psi, we're looking at a containment situation. The girl's been out here, fresh tire tracks. She's a problem we can solve." The uncle was stubborn. "She's just naive." Maya's breath caught. These weren't potential buyers. They were monitoring the pipeline. They knew what was happening, and they'd known before she did. Her uncle's death suddenly felt a lot less accidental. The men spent another 10 minutes taking readings and photographs before returning to their vehicle and driving back toward the main highway. Maya waited until the taillights disappeared completely before she allowed herself to breathe normally. Her phone showed 11:47 p.m. She needed answers, and they weren't going to come from corporate VP emails or reassuring official records. If Raymond had been right, if this pipeline really was connected to something worth killing over, then she needed to understand what was actually flowing through those 43 miles of steel. The cinder block office building looked like it hadn't been entered in years, but when Maya tried the door, it swung open easily. Someone had recently oiled the hinges. Inside, she found a space that contradicted the exterior decay: a functioning desktop computer, filing cabinets with recent maintenance logs, and a wall covered in maps and geological surveys that were decidedly newer than 2003. Someone had been using this place, recently and regularly. The computer required a password, but the filing cabinets weren't locked. Maya pulled out the first drawer and found herself looking at documents that made her blood run cold. Independent geological assessments from the past 18 months, seismic survey data, pressure test results showing a massive underground gas deposit that shouldn't exist according to the original surveys. The field hadn't been insufficient. It had been deliberately misreported. One document stood out, a memo from 2004 on Apex Energy Solutions letterhead, marked Confidential, Strategic, Reserve Designation. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the meaning was clear. A consortium of energy companies had discovered the gas field during the original survey, but had falsified the reports to federal regulators, claiming the site was non-viable. They then quietly maintained the pipeline through a shell company, waiting for the right market conditions to discover the reserve and claim it under revised extraction permits. Raymond's pipeline wasn't abandoned. It was a placeholder, a legal claim to infrastructure that would become worth hundreds of millions once the gas field was officially found, and now Maya owned it. Her phone buzzed with a new email. "Ms. Torres, this is your final courtesy notification. Apex Energy Solutions is prepared to offer $2.3 million for immediate transfer of property and pipeline assets. This offer expires in 48 hours. We strongly advise acceptance. J. Castellanos, $2.3 million. For a rusty pipe in the desert that was supposedly worthless. Maya took photographs of every document in the office, uploading them to a cloud storage account as insurance. If something happened to her, at least there would be a record. She was beginning to understand why Raymond had never sold. This wasn't about money. This was about leverage, about not letting corporations steal public resources through deliberate fraud. But Raymond was dead, and Maya was very much alone in the middle of the desert, with people who'd made it clear she was expendable. She needed allies, someone who understood how these things worked, someone who couldn't be bought. The drive back to Albuquerque took 2 hours, long enough for Maya to formulate a plan. By the time the sun rose over the Sandia Mountains, she was sitting in the cramped office of Patricia Reeves, an investigative journalist with the Albuquerque Tribune who'd made a career out of exposing energy industry corruption. Patricia was in her 50s, with the kind of weathered skepticism that came from decades of watching powerful people lie with polished smiles. She listened to Maya's story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Your uncle," Patricia said when Maya finished. "He contacted me about 8 months ago, sent me some preliminary documents about Apex's activities in the Southern Territories. I was investigating, but then he died, and the trail went cold." "You think they killed him?" "I think your uncle was a careful man who suddenly started driving like he was fleeing something. I think the accident report was conveniently vague. And I think you're sitting on evidence that could bring down a multi-billion-dollar fraud." Patricia leaned forward. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Maya had spent the drive asking herself that same question. The smart move was to take the money and walk away. $2 million would change her life. She could pay off her student loans, start her own consulting firm, never worry about rent again. But Raymond hadn't walked away. He'd spent years protecting this secret, understanding that some things were worth more than personal comfort. "I want to expose them," Maya said. "All of it. The falsified surveys, the shell companies, the fact they've been sitting on a massive gas reserve while claiming scarcity to drive up prices." Patricia smiled grimly. "That's the answer I was hoping for. But you need to understand, these people play for keeps. They've already killed your uncle, assuming my instincts are correct. They'll come after you harder if they realize you're not just a naive inheritor. What do I need to do? First, we need irrefutable documentation. The files you found are good, but we need access to Apex's internal communications, emails, memos, executive decisions, something that directly links the company leadership to the fraud." "How do we get that?" Patricia's smile turned sharp. "We make them think you're willing to deal. Set up a meeting with Castellanos. Tell him you're ready to discuss terms, but want to understand the full scope of what you're selling. Act curious but compliant. While you're in that meeting, I'll have someone on the outside who can get us what we need." It was a dangerous game, but Maya didn't see another option. She sent the email that afternoon. "Mr. Castellanos, I'm prepared to discuss your offer in person. I'd like to understand the full context of the pipeline's value before making a decision. Can we meet tomorrow at your Albuquerque office? Maya Torres." The response came within minutes. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m. I look forward to our conversation. Apex Energy Solutions occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Albuquerque, all polished marble and corporate art that probably cost more than most people's houses. Maya dressed carefully for the meeting, professional but not intimidated, someone who could be reasoned with but wasn't a complete pushover. Castellanos met her in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-40s, with the kind of casual confidence that came from never hearing the word no without a price tag attached. "Ms. Torres," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Thank you for reconsidering. I know this has been a difficult time." Maya shook his hand, noting the calculated sympathy in his voice. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the pipeline's potential value." "It's substantial," Castellanos assured her, gesturing to a leather chair. "Your uncle's property sits on what we believe could be a significant natural gas deposit. With the right development, it could provide clean energy to thousands of homes. But the original surveys said the field wasn't viable." A flicker of something crossed Castellanos' face. Annoyance, maybe, or recalculation. "Surveying technology has improved dramatically over the past 20 years. What seemed insufficient in 2003 looks very different with modern assessment tools." It was a practiced lie, delivered with the kind of smooth assurance that made Maya want to punch him. Instead, she leaned forward with manufactured curiosity. "I'd love to understand more about the technical side. I studied petroleum engineering, so I'm not entirely in the dark about how extraction works." "What changed in the geological assessment?" Castellanos launched into an explanation filled with technical jargon: horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing techniques, improved seismic imaging. All of it was true in general terms, but meaningless in this specific context. He was banking on her being impressed by complexity rather than questioning the underlying premise. While he talked, Maya's phone buzzed discreetly in her pocket. A text from Patricia. "Got it. Get out safely." Maya let Castellanos finish his presentation, then asked about environmental impact assessments, permitting timelines, and community benefit agreements. She played the role of someone who was genuinely considering the offer, but wanted to do due diligence. "I appreciate your thoroughness," Castellanos said after 45 minutes. "It's refreshing to work with someone who understands the technical aspects. I think we can structure a deal that benefits everyone involved." "I need a few days to think about it," Maya said, standing. "This is a big decision." Castellanos' smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But I should mention, we're not the only company interested in this opportunity. If you wait too long, the offer may not remain available." It was a threat wrapped in a business warning, and Maya recognized it for what it was. They were running out of patience. She left the building and drove directly to Patricia's office, where the journalist was already combing through files on her computer screen. "They kept everything," Patricia said, shaking her head in amazement. "Emails going back 15 years, internal strategy documents, financial projections that show they've known about the gas field the entire time. They even have contingency plans for managing landowners who don't cooperate." "Is that what happened to Raymond?" Patricia pulled up an email chain from 9 months ago. "Look at this. Raymond Torres continues to refuse all buyout offers and has made contact with media sources. Recommend escalating to secondary protocols." That email is from Castellanos to someone named Victor Petrov, who, according to my research, is a security consultant with a very interesting background in making problems disappear. Maya felt sick. "They murdered him. We can't prove that directly, but we can prove the fraud. And once federal investigators start digging into their activities, I guarantee the accident will get a fresh look." Patricia turned away from the screen. "We're going to the FBI with this, tomorrow. I've already reached out to a contact at their white-collar crime division. They're very interested in what we've found. What happens to the pipeline? That's up to you. Legally, you still own it. But once this breaks, there's going to be a federal investigation into the gas field and how extraction permits were obtained. My guess is the government will seize the whole operation under asset forfeiture laws. It wasn't the ending Maya had imagined when she'd first stood in front of those rising pressure gauges. She wouldn't become a millionaire. She wouldn't maintain some lucrative mineral rights that set her up for life. But she would expose a fraud that had stolen public resources and cost her uncle his life. Sometimes justice was its own reward. Sometimes it had to be. The story broke 3 days later. Patricia's article, Energy Giant's 20-Year Fraud, How Apex Energy Solutions Hid Billions in Natural Gas to Manipulate Markets, went viral immediately. Within hours, federal investigators raided Apex's offices in Albuquerque, Houston, and Denver. Castellanos was arrested trying to board a private plane to Singapore. Stock prices for the consortium companies plummeted. Maya watched it unfold from her apartment, feeling strangely disconnected from the chaos she'd helped unleash. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters, lawyers, relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly interested in her well-being. But the call that mattered came on the 4th day, from a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Torres? This is Special Agent Marcus Chen with the FBI. I'm heading up the investigation into Apex Energy Solutions. I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation and let you know that we've uncovered evidence linking the company to your uncle's death. We're pursuing criminal charges against several individuals, including Victor Petrov. Maya's voice caught. They really killed him. We believe so, yes. Mr. Petrov's travel records place him in New Mexico the night of the accident. We've also found electronic communications that suggest the incident was deliberately staged. I'm sorry for your loss, but I want you to know your uncle's death won't go unanswered. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The investigation dragged on for months, each new revelation adding layers to the corruption. The gas field, it turned out, was even larger than the falsified reports had hidden, potentially one of the biggest deposits in the Southwest. The fraud had cost taxpayers billions in lost royalties and had artificially inflated energy prices across multiple states. Maya became an unlikely public figure, the engineering graduate who'd taken down an industry giant. She was offered book deals, consulting positions, speaking engagements. Most of them she declined. She wasn't interested in becoming a professional whistleblower or turning her uncle's death into a personal brand. Instead, she did something simpler. She used her engineering degree to work with the federal government on developing transparent protocols for assessing and developing public energy resources. She testified before Congress about the need for independent verification of geological surveys. She made sure that what had happened with Apex couldn't easily happen again. And sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she drove out to the desert station where it had all begun. The pipeline was now under federal management, properly operated with full environmental oversight. The pressure gauges were monitored by government employees who filed public reports on extraction rates and safety protocols. The desert had given up its secret. The buried wealth that powerful people had tried to hide and hoard was now serving its intended purpose, providing energy to communities that needed it, with revenues funding schools and infrastructure instead of executive bonuses. Maya would stand at the fence line, looking at the facility lit up against the dark sky, and think about Raymond, about the stubbornness that had kept him saying no when everyone else would have taken the money, about the envelope he'd left her with its cryptic warning that had seemed paranoid but had saved her life. The desert keeps secrets better than people do. He'd been right about that. But secrets once exposed lost their power. What had been buried came to light. What had been stolen was returned, however imperfectly, to its rightful purpose. On a cold December night, almost a year after inheriting the pipeline, Maya found herself back at the station one more time. She'd brought flowers, desert marigolds, Raymond's favorites, and a bottle of decent whiskey. She poured a shot onto the sand, a small offering to the uncle who'd trusted her with his burden. "We did it," she said to the empty desert. "It wasn't clean and it wasn't easy, but we did it." The wind carried sand across the rusted metal, the same wind that had blown here for thousands of years before pipelines and pressure gauges and corporate fraud. The same wind that would blow long after all of this was forgotten. But for now, in this moment, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of meaning. Her uncle's death had been avenged. His stubbornness had been validated. The secret he'd protected had been shared with the world, not hoarded by those who would exploit it. She took a shot of whiskey herself, wincing at the burn, then poured the rest onto the sand beside the flowers. Tomorrow, she'd return to Albuquerque, to her small apartment and her consulting work, and the slow process of building a life that felt authentic. But tonight, she could stand in the desert and remember that sometimes ordinary people could win against extraordinary power. Sometimes the pressure building beneath the surface wasn't a threat. Sometimes it was the force needed to crack open systems that had grown too corrupt, too comfortable in their deception. The gauges on the panel behind her showed normal readings now, properly monitored, properly reported, serving their intended purpose. No more mysteries, no more hidden agendas, just the straightforward work of extracting resources responsibly and distributing the benefits fairly. Maya walked back to her truck, leaving the flowers and the empty bottle as markers of what had been lost and what had been gained. The desert night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky in patterns that had guided travelers for centuries before GPS and satellites. She thought about calling her mother, about trying to explain what the past year had meant. But some things couldn't be translated into comfortable explanations. Some journeys were too personal, too shaped by grief and anger and determination to be easily shared. Instead, she started the truck and pointed it toward the highway, toward the distant lights of civilization, toward whatever came next. The inheritance Raymond had left her hadn't been money or land or even the pipeline itself. It had been the example of standing firm when standing firm mattered, of refusing to let powerful people steal what should belong to everyone, of believing that one person's stubbornness could, sometimes against all odds, make a difference. The desert fell away behind her, dark and vast and eternal. Somewhere beneath that sand and rock, gas flowed through 43 miles of pipe, no longer a secret to be hoarded, but a resource to be shared. The pressure had been released, not in an explosion, but in a slow, deliberate process of exposure and accountability. Maya turned on the radio, letting classic rock fill the truck's cab, and allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in months. A smile, not of triumph or satisfaction, but of simple completion. The story that had begun with rising pressure gauges and cryptic warnings had reached its end. Not the ending she'd expected when she'd first inherited that piece of desert, but the ending that felt right. Justice was slow and imperfect, but it was real. Her uncle's stubbornness had been passed to her like a genetic inheritance, and she'd used it to crack open a conspiracy that had operated in darkness for 2 decades. The powerful men who'd thought themselves untouchable were facing prison. The stolen resources were being returned to public use. The system had been bent but not broken. As she reached the highway and turned north toward home, Maya made a decision. She would tell the full story someday. Write it down, make sure it was recorded for anyone else who might inherit an impossible burden and need to know that standing firm was possible. That ordinary people could still defeat extraordinary corruption if they refused to be intimidated. But not yet. First, she would simply live, sleep without nightmares, work without looking over her shoulder. Build a life that honored Raymond's memory not through constant vigilance, but through the simple act of being someone who'd stood up when it mattered and could now move forward. The lights of Albuquerque appeared on the horizon, a constellation of human ambition and hope spread across the desert valley. Maya drove toward them, leaving the pipeline behind but carrying its lessons forward. The desert had revealed its secret. The pressure had been explained. The inheritance had been understood. And somewhere in the vast silence of the New Mexico night, she liked to think Raymond was finally at rest, knowing that the burden he'd carried alone for so long had been shared, exposed, and transformed into something that served justice rather than greed. The gauges would keep measuring, the gas would keep flowing, but now it would flow honestly, monitored by people who served the public interest rather than private profit. That was enough. It would have to be enough. And on this cold December night, driving home through the desert darkness, with flowers left behind as tribute, Maya Torres decided it actually was.